Texas Monthly.
In the summer of 2015, Kearney was at a hotel in Arlington, Virginia, not far from the Pentagon, for the annual meeting of the National League of POW MIA Families. At these meetings, there were always volunteers, usually experts in military jargon or history, who could help families make sense of what the government had told them about their missing relatives' cases. One night, Kearney met up with one of these volunteers at the hotel bar, a researcher named Jay Veit. Jay had been a tank officer in the Army. He went on to get his PhD in history. He'd been researching POW MIA issues for almost 25 years.
Jay and I had become good friends, and also the kind of buddies that you can just commiserate with. So if you just had something crappy, or can you believe that, or whatever, we were just, let's hang out, have a drink, and bitch about this together.
Jay asked her about the latest report she'd gotten about her dad's case.
And I had some expletives that came out of my mouth, and he asked to see my scrub sheet. I'm like, oh, whatever this is worth, sure.
A scrub sheet is what the Defense Department calls its written updates about missing service members.
So I give him the scrub sheet, and he's looking at it, he's like, I don't think this part here makes any sense.
Jay had been collaborating with Merle Pribenow, the former CIA officer you heard in the first episode, to acquire and translate Vietnamese histories of the war. One of the books Merle had translated showed that senior North Vietnamese commanders had given orders that all shootdowns and all pilots killed or captured should be carefully accounted for. North Vietnamese officials knew that when the war ended, POWs would be part of negotiations with the United States. So Jay figured that Ron Forrester, shot down just a month before the war ended, should be accounted for too, in North Vietnamese records.
And I'm kind of looking at him like, yeah, Mr. Know-It-All. How are you going to know whether that makes sense or not? You haven't seen the whole case file. But he said, no, something's not right.
Kearney's scrub sheet had next to no information about North Vietnamese reporting on the shootdown.
So he takes pictures of it and sends it to his buddy Merle.
Here's Jay.
I remember it so clearly because I was literally sitting here. Kearney's to my left. There's a bunch of us yakking. My cell phone email goes off. This is the opening sentence. It literally took me 20 minutes to find information about the shootdown. And I'm like, I turned to her. I'm like, you're not going to believe this. And I show it to her.
Merle had found a reference to an A-6 shot down on December 27, 1972, and the name of the anti-aircraft regiment that shot it down. Jay was convinced there was more information out there about Ron Forrester and Jim Chipman's fates, and what he'd discover, with the help of a small team of former military and intelligence operatives, would breathe new life into a case that had gone cold. From Texas Monthly, I'm Josh Alvarez, and this is The Final Flight of Captain Forrester. Episode 3, The Four Horsemen. After the war, in the 80s and early 90s, the government did keep investigating what happened to Ron Forrester and Jim Chipman. But until that first report they sent, not much of what they learned reached Kearney. Sometimes, Ron Forrester's name would just turn up in some new history of the war. One time in the early 90s, Kearney was at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial with other sons and daughters who'd lost a parent in the war, and someone told her about a new book. She was about 21 when this happened.
In this book, it talks about how one Vietnamese officer's son was killed, and so they brought out one of the American prisoners they had and executed him to lift the morale of the Vietnamese troops.
The book, it's called The Bamboo Cage, didn't name the POW who was executed, but it listed 13 names. It said the prisoner killed that day was one of them.
One of these people was the one that was executed, and my dad's name was on that list.
Years later, Kearney was able to track down the guy who the book cited as the source of this information. And when she finally reached him, he didn't remember her dad's name. Kearney still isn't sure how her dad's name wound up in there, but at the time, it really freaked her out.
Because, I mean, it might as well have said they pulled Ron Forrester out and shot him in the head. I mean, you would think it had with the way that I felt about it.
And she had so little else to go on, so little firm information. This was true for MIA families generally. They were pretty much in the dark. Then in the 90s, a few things changed. The US and Vietnam had begun reestablishing diplomatic relations. And in 1991, before the US even had an embassy in Vietnam, it opened an office for MIA affairs in Hanoi. It was the first US government presence in Vietnam since 1975. Then in 1992, Congress created an agency in the Department of Defense dedicated to finding missing personnel. Today, that office is called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA. In 1995, the DPAA started holding meetings with families about the search for their relatives and providing yearly reports.
All right. All of a sudden, all this information is released, supposedly going to answer all the questions remaining about Vietnam.
But this new transparency also created new questions. Remember that report you heard about in the last episode that Kearney got when she was still in college?
And I get this report, and it's the most disgusting thing that I'd read. It didn't come with a rated R on the front page for me to be prepared that I'm about to read complete gore.
According to the report, American investigators traveled to Quang Binh province and went to a village called An Thuy, where people said they'd seen a plane shot down 20 years earlier. Witnesses said they'd found the pilot's remains, a piece of skull with hair still attached, and a dismembered leg and torso, but no identification on the remains. These witnesses showed investigators where they'd buried the remains, but the places were all inaccessible. Some were flooded. One burial site had been covered later by a concrete pigsty. But as Kearney read this report, she also saw that it mentioned dates that didn't make any sense.
But it's talking about stuff in 1968 and then 1967.
Years before Ron had even deployed.
And the whole time I'm reading it, I'm like, my dad was going to school down the street from where I'm standing right now. I know where my dad was at all these dates. He's accounted for at Texas A&M. But if the dates, if you're reading something and half of it's wrong, how do you say that the other half is right? How do you know that any of these body parts relate to my dad if it's got the wrong date? I mean, after you get something like that, you question every report you're given for a while.
The early investigations did turn up other details that were more solid. But these also prompted more questions. Witnesses said that Forrester's remains had been buried, but were later exhumed and moved to another location, and that they were later exhumed again and moved somewhere else. American investigators asked Vietnamese officials about these remains, but the officials said they'd been lost. And the investigators were shown some of the wreckage, 2 pieces of tires, and other airplane parts. They took photos of the parts, but couldn't say for certain if they'd come from an A6. Investigators also found an old photograph, a twisted pile of wreckage next to a rice paddy, surrounded by people who appeared to be Vietnamese militia. The photo was in the Quang Binh Provincial Museum, and the label said that this was the 700th plane shot down by local forces during the war. It even had a date, December 27th, 1972. Still, American investigators couldn't tell what kind of plane was in the picture. After that visit, the lead American investigator said he believed the Vietnamese government had been interfering in the search. Witnesses had told investigators they'd been coached by Vietnamese government officials on what to say. While the team was there, the NSA intercepted a message from the Vietnamese government to the local leadership in Quang Binh, telling the local officials to, quote, block any attempts by the American MIA search team to contact people or take illegal photographs. Investigators returned in 1993, 94, and 95. They interviewed the same witnesses and toured more places where villagers said they'd found wreckage, but the sites couldn't be excavated. They were in the middle of rice paddies, under up to 6 feet of muddy water. From 1996 to 2015, investigators went back 6 more times, but they didn't make much headway. More conflicting eyewitness testimony, no identifiable aircraft parts, and no remains.
But I can be real honest that there's years that I would get my scrub sheet and I'd just flip to the back to see if they added anything. Well, do I have any new highlights? Yes or no?
A lot of times, the answer was no. For Jay, Ron Forrester's case offered a chance to make use of the expertise he'd been building for more than 3 decades. In the early 90s, the U.S. Senate opened a special committee to investigate the POW MIA issue and started holding public hearings.
I started watching the hearings, and then I began attending the league meetings and a few other meetings, and people were welcoming. I was just sort of, what they call a concerned citizen.
And he got interested in the idea of cracking these cases.
I was always, even as a young child, fascinated by historical mysteries, and was also concurrently loved military histories.
Jay and I met on a sunny October morning in a university library in Washington, D.C. It was a fitting setting. He's the author of 5 books, all of them about the Vietnam War, 2 of which focus on the POW MIA issue. Jay has a professorial air about him, but he also speaks with a frankness that kind of reminds me of a gruff, brilliant detective who isn't shy about calling out other people for work he finds less than stellar.
For whatever reasons, the U.S. government teams had shown, in our mind, an astonishing lack of investigative interest. They re-interviewed the same handful of witnesses. They had not broadened the investigative scope. They had not asked to talk to other people. They had not asked to look at village records. They had not asked to see the evidence.
Carony scrub sheets only told part of the story. That's something Jay understood from his research. The Vietnamese records held a lot of answers, if you knew where to look.
The Vietnamese communists have published an enormous amount of material in the war, their own histories, after-action reports, because they're justifiably proud of their victory and the unification of the country, but they were also trying to just create a history for their future generations.
Jay had seen how Vietnamese documents could create a breadcrumb trail to find servicemen. A lot of times, the documents were summaries of original reports, overviews of multiple incidents, maybe not much detail about the one event you were looking for, but they could provide a crucial piece of information that did. Jay saw investigators that interviewed lots and lots of witnesses, but they didn't dig as deeply into the records.
Even though DPA was asking the Vietnamese for information, they were far more interested in finding the one guy who could say, Josh Alvarez is buried here. And then they go dig. Nope, that's not. Yeah, maybe it's this tree. And they go over there and dig, right? And this became really the main point of contention between what we were trying to do, which was take it from a much higher perspective and say, the Vietnamese clearly had records. Instead of us having to go and guess where we're digging based upon this guy's testimony and hope to get lucky, let's get what the Vietnamese have.
For Jay, the best bet to find out what the Vietnamese knew about Tiny 05 started with Merle Pribonneau. After 27 years of clandestine service for the American government, including assignments in Vietnam, Thailand, and Hong Kong, Merle retired to a quiet, suburban street just outside Washington, D.C.
Hi, Merle.
Joshua.
Do you want my shoes off?
You can leave it. Take them off in here. That's fine. You can step into the.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
He's short, with a slight but fit frame, and moved nimbly down the stairs leading to his basement. His wispy hair was neatly combed, and he was courteous and curious about me and the podcast, but at first also seemed a little cagey. No surprise for a former CIA spy.
This used to be my office. This is almost all Vietnamese books here.
Right.
This is mostly Vietnamese. That's all Vietnamese.
Merle retired from the CIA in the 90s.
And I was kind of casting around. I had some temporary jobs and everything.
But Vietnam, the war, the mistakes and missed opportunities, and its lingering mysteries, stuck with him.
I was very interested in the history of the war, because of my background and everything, and figuring out what really did happen during the war, and looking at things from not just an American point of view, but from the Vietnamese point of view.
Merle started collecting books and translating them into English. At one point, he translated the official history of the North Vietnamese Army during the war, a 500-page epic spanning 20 years.
And so I translated the complete book. Actually, I have a copy here somewhere. That's it.
Wow.
And that was one of the first things I did. It took me a while.
He and Jay had been working together for about 15 years when Jay contacted Merle about Kearney's scrub sheet.
Okay, here, I was looking in the wrong place. Here it is. Okay, on 27 December, the 227th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment shot down one A6A. This was the 700th U.S. aircraft to be shot down by the soldiers and civilians of Quang Binh, and the 138th aircraft that the division has shot down since the date of the division's formation.
Merle also found and translated news reports of the crash. An article from the People's Army newspaper, Quan Doi Nan Dien, described how Army troops and militia members shot down the plane. This is Merle's translation. On the night of 27 December, the northeastern monsoon winds chilled the firing positions, but the officers and men still boiled with hatred of the enemy. They were determined to open fire in time to punish our enemy for the deaths of citizens of Hanoi, of Haiphong, of North and South Vietnam, and of their native Quang Binh province, whom the enemy had murdered. The paper describes how, around 8:50 that night, an American A-6 flew over Quang Binh province, near An Thuy. Anti-aircraft gunners began to fire. And then, quote, the aircraft was hit and exploded in a ball of flames. Many pieces of the plane were scattered across the fields, while the main part of the aircraft crashed into a newly plowed, water-filled rice paddy. The bodies of the two sky pirates were blown apart, along with their aircraft. Merle translated two more articles that also mentioned the shootdown, and they were clearly propaganda. But to Jay and Merle, they were also full of details that might explain what happened to Ron Forrester. All the stories mention that this was the 700th plane shot down in Quang Binh, so it was clearly a significant event. Army regiments and militias received awards for bringing down the plane, and the stories named them. This village, An Thuy, is small, situated on a canal, and surrounded by fields of rice paddies. It's in the central part of Vietnam. Just a few miles to the east is the Gulf of Tonkin and the South China Sea. To the west, on a clear day, you can see all the way to a lush mountain range, with a distinctive saddleback that almost looks like the side profile of a person's face. The border with Laos is just beyond it. American investigators had visited An Thuy. They clearly had a sense that this could be where the plane went down. But whatever they'd gotten so far, it seemed like it hadn't convinced them. They still hadn't started digging.
And the idea was not just to say, oh, look at all the little jewels we found, but to be able to actually put an X on the ground for both the government and for Kearney. To do that, we needed imagery, and imagery as close to the crash date as possible.
An old Army friend put Jay in touch with a Defense Department analyst who had experience with old military photos going back to World War II. His name was Lou Schweitzer.
He knew exactly what we were doing. And so he began to go to the National Archives to look at film.
Lou's specialty was analyzing aerial photography. He'd helped search for other missing servicemen from Vietnam and other wars. This was painstaking work, squinting at old photographs taken from a plane, and very early satellite photography.
You know, we're talking old school stuff. The National Archives has these light tables, which, from my experience, those went out of business, 30 years ago for the most part.
This is Lou.
So you've got light tables, you put the film on a roll, you roll it underneath a microscope, and you look at it that way. But that's about as high-tech as this process goes with the images that we have to deal with.
Lou had a target for his search, a group of rice paddies on the northwest side of Antwi. Now he needed to see if there were any photos of it.
You would put in a request. It would take 3 days to a week to get the imagery out of cold storage, and you're limited to 10 cans of film at that point, and then you're able to look at it.
A couple times a month, Lou would drive from his home in Virginia to the National Archives facility in Maryland to see what had come in. This was all on his own time. All along, the team was giving Kearney updates on their progress and everything they were up against.
And that it's really, a needle in a haystack, because while these cans might be labeled, do they really have the right content in them? And are you having to pull different cans? And we don't have the satellite photography of this was 2 days before and 2 days after. So what we were looking at is what was there in June, July of 1972. And then the next good clean look at that is March of 73.
So I remember buddy of mine were just at a bar, and my cell phone again goes off, and Lou had written up a report because I found something. And he had found a film from about 3.5 months after the crash site, and he's looking down at that rice paddy, and you could see craters.
Craters. At first, it looked like this was their big break. But when Lou looked at it, he noticed the big crater was round, more like a bomb blast than a plane crash. Then he found more photos taken a few years earlier, and the big crater was there too. One of the legacies of the war, and particularly the Linebacker II operation, is that much of North Vietnam was absolutely torn apart by bombing. Across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the U.S. dropped about 3 times the tonnage of bombs as it did during all of World War II. So the potential crash site just happened to be where another bomb had fallen.
You think you've got something that looks like the right, it looks like the right area, but you go back and you find that, the biggest crater was always there. It was there 5 years earlier or something like that. That's a big disappointment.
What Lou didn't see in the photo was any wreckage. But witnesses had told the government how they'd scavenged the wreck the day after the plane went down. So this could still be the spot. Jay still had another lead in mind, and to chase it down, he brought in a 4th member for the team, a college professor and former Air Force pilot named Joseph Mortati, who'd been recommended to Jay by the director of the League.
I graduated from the Air Force Academy with a degree in military history, and then I flew the F-4 Phantom for 6.5 years.
Joseph was a committed MIA researcher, and he loved getting to spend time with a tough case.
Basically, for about 10 years, I worked more or less by myself on aircraft cases and was able to help provide some operational context to families, help them ask some questions.
Joseph's background meant he could look at a scrub sheet that wouldn't mean much to most people and see the story behind all the coordinates and acronyms. At his first League meeting, he saw the kind of information family members were getting. He says it was like a doctor telling you that someone you love had died. And then, when you asked what happened, just handing you a bunch of lab work and MRI scans.
When they say things like, the IT Team 4 went to grid coordinate X-ray Delta 1120-90317. Well, that's probably somewhere in Southeast Asia, but, what does that mean?
Joseph began researching MIA cases by accident, not long after the death of his mother. He'd been thinking about the time they got to spend together, near the end.
About 6 weeks before my mom died, it was just she and I at my parents' house where I grew up. And I just told her every single thing I ever wanted to say. How much I love her, how much, she was going to live on through her children and grandchildren. And, that is a real gift.
Around that time, he'd also been working on a history of his Air Force squadron. And he came across a post on a message board from a woman whose father had flown with the squadron during Vietnam. He'd gone missing in the war, and he was still missing.
And, I realized we both lost a parent, but I got the gift of saying goodbye.
Joseph looked into her father's case and found that he could provide additional insight to what was in her scrub sheet. He started attending League meetings and helping other families with their cases, and teaming up with other volunteer researchers. But joining Jay's team was a step up.
And the thing that made this team the best team I ever worked with is that we brought very distinct but complementary skills to the table. And we're all total strangers. We're all veterans. And it just turned out that we had just extraordinarily good chemistry.
So these were the four guys. Joseph was the aviation expert. Lou studied imagery. Merle was the translator. And Jay was the leader, reviewing their research and trying to poke holes in it. And after a while, some people in the government had a nickname for those four guys who kept turning up with notes on the case: the Four Horsemen.
And Joseph did a lot of the interviews with some of the folks that flew with Dad to understand what the normal path was that they would take, whether they ever deviated from that, to try and get a better idea of, this is when they were last heard from, try to zero in on where we think the crash site occurred.
They wanted to piece together a story that made sense, so they could go back to the government and say, if you go and dig here, this is where you'll find the remains of Ron Forrester and Jim Chipman. And they knew narrowing a search to a target that small wouldn't be easy.
But you're talking about aircraft that can go, they can be going 1,000 feet per second. So there wasn't a crash site per se. It wasn't a crater in the ground. There's more like a debris field.
Joseph started by piecing together what the scrub sheets said about Tiny 05's mission that night. The notes described their mission as armed reconnaissance.
So armed reconnaissance is kind of what it sounds like. You're looking for something. You don't know exactly what you're looking for.
And actually, Joseph says when he was flying, there's no way he would have been given a mission like this, knowing so little about his target, and with weapons that were so difficult to aim.
They basically said, hey, you got this road, there was also some rivers, and there was a rail line. So 80 miles, good luck, we're all counting on you. Go and see what you can find. So I think if you were to do that today, that'd probably be considered criminal.
The targets, the Londai Ferry, and the roads leading to it, they were crowded with anti-aircraft guns.
It wasn't some sophisticated air defense. It wasn't a surface-to-air missile. They probably fired based on sound.
But Joseph says any pilot knows it only takes one lucky round to bring them down. They call it the Golden BB.
A single 37 millimeter round in the right place. If you hit it like in the belly of the airplane, even today, you could take out a modern aircraft with a single 50 caliber round or single 20 millimeter in the right place.
The records Merle had translated held some promising clues as to where the plane might have gone down. But some of the reports contradict one another.
There are two reports, there's two Vietnamese reports of an aircraft that was shot down in Quang Binh province that night. And they're I think they were like 5 or 8 minutes apart.
The two sites that reported a crash were about 15 miles apart. One was near the Londai Ferry, that pontoon bridge that Tiny 05 had been targeting. Forces at the ferry reported the shootdown at 8:45 p.m. The other was southeast, in Antui. Forces there reported the shootdown at 8:50 p.m. In order to figure out which one was right, Joseph decided he needed to know about the route Forrester and Chipman were flying, and what their orders were that night. A report mentioned the name of the officer who gave an intelligence briefing at Nam Phan on the night of December 27th. So Joseph tracked him down, and with the officer's help, Joseph got an idea of their plan. They were targeting the highway that ran north-south toward the Londai River crossing, approaching from the south. But instead of flying right over the road, they attacked it from the sides, swooping in from one direction, and then turning and swooping in from the other direction further up the road.
They'd go out 5 or 6 miles, turn around, come back. Ron Forrester was the bombardier navigator in the right seat. He'd take a look at that, see if he could find anything, designate a target, drop a bomb on it, and then they would go back and forth until they reached what's called bingo fuel. They had to go home.
Once he understood those orders, Joseph was able to sketch out a flight path.
Because if you know an aircraft's altitude, airspeed, and bank angle, you can calculate the turn rate and radius, and you can actually plot out a course over the ground.
Joseph started the clock at 8:45 at the Londai Ferry. At 1 minute 58 seconds, Tiny 05 would have been over the water and turning back towards land. At 3 minutes 58 seconds, they would have straightened out and started heading towards the highway. But as Joseph plotted their course, he realized that at 4 minutes and 46 seconds, they would have flown right over Antwi.
So imagine you're crossing this north-south road. There's a report there, and then 5 minutes later, there's a report that's about 15 miles or so to the southeast. So we assumed that they were heading on an easterly towards the water. So if you go out over the water and then you turn around and come back, all right, it's within 30 seconds of the reported time of the shoot down near this village of Antwi, where there was a local militia unit that happened to have anti-aircraft guns.
All this added up to a conclusion. The second shoot-down report was almost certainly the accurate one. The way Joseph figured, gunners at the first site to the north shot at Tiny 05 as it passed overhead and claimed they'd shot it down. But the plane didn't go down. It kept going on its mission, east over the Gulf of Tonkin. Then it doubled back, passing over the village of Antwi, where it took more fire. And this time, it went down. None of this gave the team the X on the ground they'd been looking for, but they hoped they'd given Kearney something she could use.
So you've got decades of heartache and just not knowing, is the government lying to me? And then to be able to come back and say something like, okay, we found a way to reconcile these two reports. And we think that DPAA is correct in that the focus of where they should be looking for Chipman and Forrester's aircraft is near this village of Antwi, not over up north near the Long Dive Ferry.
In fact, what they'd done was narrow the search back down to the same village the American investigators had visited in the 90s.
So among the early trips to this village, the local people brought forth different artifacts and said, you know, my grandfather gave, my father gave this to you.
One of these artifacts was a long sheet of metal, a speed brake from an aircraft to help it slow down in flight. Someone in Antwi had repurposed it as a floor for their shed. And then there were 2 tires, all of which could have come from Tiny 05.
And so, this is really useful and intriguing stuff. But the big problem, though, is that you don't know the provenance on it. Just because somebody has a piece of an aircraft, it doesn't necessarily mean it's from the one that crashed nearby.
But as Joseph is studying the pictures, he can make out some writing on the sidewalls of the tires.
And it said, Chenuit, Baltimore, U.S. Navy, 1965. So Chenuit was a company that made, I think they started in the 1940s making aircraft tires, and they did so up until the early 1970s.
The investigators had also measured the tires. Some of the notes said the tires were 50 by 22 by 19.
This means the tire was 50 inches in diameter, 22 inches wide with 19 plies. A big tire, about the size of a 747 main gear.
Way bigger than the tires on an A6. That doesn't make much sense to Joseph. So he calls the tire company. Or he calls the company that bought the tire company.
How might I direct your call? Hi, my name is Joseph Mortati. I'm a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. And I need to find information about a tire made by a company you bought in the early 70s called Chenuit. And a tire was made for the U.S. Navy in 1965. A predictably long pause. And why might you be interested in that, Professor? Like, I got a real live one here today.
So Joseph explains what he's up to.
And next thing I know, I'm talking to the CEO of the company, puts me on speakerphone, brings in a couple of tire engineers, talk for about 15 or 20 minutes.
The tire execs and the engineers go into their records. They come back and say,
yeah, we don't think Chenuit ever made a 50 by 22 by 19. Maybe it's a truck tire.
A big American truck tire in a village north of the DMZ.
The CEO said, well, listen, if you really want to know, you should call Rudy at the Tire and Rim Association. And I thought, Rudy, my man at the Tire and Rim Association.
Joseph calls, and Rudy says, all right, send me everything you've got.
A couple days later, he calls me back and says, the guys at Specialty Tires were right. Chenuet never made a 50 by 22 by 19 aircraft tire. And I thought, damn. And he said, but you got a bigger problem. Well, what's that? Nobody in the history of aircraft tire anywhere in the world ever made a 50 by 22 by 19. That tire does not exist.
But Rudy has an idea. He contacts a guy named Keith, who manages the tire program at the Navy. And Keith reaches out to a guy at a scrapyard for old planes, what's called a boneyard.
Who contacted a guy at the boneyard, who contacted people at Goodyear, at Dunlop, B.F. Goodrich, and all on their own, just because they cared about, figuring out what happened to these guys.
And at some point during all of this, somebody looks at the photos again, and they realize the dimensions had been recorded in the case file backwards. The tires were 20 inches in diameter, not 50. The 5 was a 2 flipped backwards. And the width of the tire wasn't 22, it was 5.5. And the size of the tires on the nose gear of an A6, 20 inches by 5.5 inches.
So now we have something that's from an A6 intruder. We don't know which intruder it came from, but we know it came from an intruder. And the nearest intruder that was lost nearby, I want to say it was like 8 or 10 miles to the southwest. Okay, so the universe of possibilities is getting smaller and smaller.
By now, Jay and the team had spent more than a year on the case, and they were running out of loose threads to tug on.
I wasn't trying to prove the government wrong or right. I was trying to figure out where that plane was. And that meant broadening the evidentiary net as wide as possible.
Jay says they had to be willing to go down a few rabbit holes, like Joseph's Odyssey with the truck tire.
Because sometimes going down a rabbit hole will do either you find absolutely nothing and completely wasted your time, or it takes you and opens up a path that you didn't think about.
Even if it's just to eliminate the other theories.
Yeah, we discovered we could not put an X on the ground, but we had narrowed the possibilities down dramatically.
They had wound up pretty much where they'd started, somewhere around the village of Antwi. But now they were more sure of where they stood. To learn more would require the Defense Department to search through Vietnamese records, something Jay says it hadn't done much in the years before.
What we quickly discovered was a complete lack of interest on DPAA's part to conduct more thorough research on what the Vietnamese might have.
If the Defense Department investigators still needed more proof, Jay and the team were convinced that the Vietnamese war records held the key.
So it became obvious that, okay, we'd reached the end of the line here. There was nothing else we could do because there was nothing else to examine. We were not physically able to go there. The U.S. government had not recovered any other pieces. They had just gone out and said, yep, that's a flooded rice field, and left. So at that point, it was my job to summarize everything we had done, to lay out the evidence that we had not only uncovered, but had pieced together differently than the government had.
First, Jay shared it with Kearney.
And it was incredible to me, just the work that Jay and the team did, so very incredible. That type of work I had never seen done really for anybody before.
The team had found promising evidence that Tiny 05's crash site was around Antwi, where the government had been looking. But they said only more research into Vietnamese records could finally put an X on the ground to start digging. With Kearney's support, Jay and the team presented their findings at the next League of Families meeting in the summer of 2017.
We weren't trying to create some bombshell to throw and be like, we told you weren't doing your job right. No, it wasn't to be combative at all. It was more to supplement work that they hadn't done or information that they had gotten wrong. Because the end goal is go dig that hole and see if you can find my dad.
So Joseph stood up, talked about this, Lou talked about the imagery, Merle talked about translations, and then I summed it up. And I walked off stage, and the head of DPA literally slapped me on the shoulder and, was like, and he's just chewing my ass. And I'm like, General, we understand each of your analysts has got 200, 300, 400 cases per person. You guys are a mile wide and an inch deep, whereas we can do the exact opposite. We can be, an inch wide and a mile deep. Let us help you here.
Jay saw Ron Forrester's case as a chance for the league to work with the government, to build a process that could help other families too. But the Defense Department brass didn't seem to agree.
Yes, there was not thank God you guys did a wonderful thing. We did not get that reaction.
So you've been hearing about this government agency, the DPAA. Its origins trace back to the Vietnam War and the advocacy of the women who founded the League of POW MIA Families. Today, the DPAA has about 700 people to account for missing Americans from all wars since World War II, not just Vietnam. That amounts to more than 81,000 individuals.
You're just going to walk to my desk and we're done.
Last fall, I visited the place where the DPAA coordinates the searches for missing service members. The campus includes the world's largest forensic anthropology laboratory, and it's inside Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Honolulu. That's where I met Bob Maves. He's one of the agency's longest-serving analysts, and he helped work on the Forrester case. So this building is relatively new. It seems
2015.
Like 2015.
Yeah, so the trailer that I used to work in, right, you'll see it up on blocks ready to get pulled out.
Bob served in the Army for 20 years before becoming a civilian analyst, searching for missing service members.
My trailer used to be, I love that trailer, right? I didn't want to come here. I want to stay in the trailer. Life was a lot easier than up here.
Right. Bob is hilarious. Like a lot of people I met at DPAA, he's full of stories from digs in extreme situations all over the world.
And the only reason my tent didn't fall down that night, I stayed there and held the pole for like 6 hours, right? No, we're not going down, right? God bless America. I got 3 more to this shit. No. But we got 9 guys out of that recovery. I mean, some of the stuff we did, you're just going, really? No one else would have done stuff like that, but we did back then.
His desk looks like the desk of an analyst. Tall stacks of papers everywhere. But he knows where everything is.
Because you're working on one, you're working on several at the same time, not just working on one at a time, right? So like this one here, right? We're out there trying to tell the Vietnamese team where to go.
Today, he's a supervisor of the Vietnam War branch of the agency's research division.
The hard part is that the Vietnam War is kind of the start of the accounting, that we're going out and doing recoveries, right? I mean, World War II, they did it on a case-by-case basis, right? But you didn't go investigate. Somebody told you the site's here, you went and dug it. Well, now we've expanded in the Korean War, we're in World War II, we're everywhere. But the remains that we have are going to get identified. Due to all the great technology and that's constantly improving, individuals are going home. That's the big thing.
Bob is someone Karen worked with a lot over the years.
I've loved Bob for a very long time. And instinctively, not only is he just a character, in general, it's a type of personality I'm drawn to because you can just kind of eat popcorn and watch him go, right? He clearly had a heart for the mission. I could tell that. And it was no bullshit.
Bob didn't always have good news for Kearney, but he earned her respect.
I like someone that's going to shoot straight. And I might not like what you have to tell me, but if I know what you're telling me is true, I can work with that. And I didn't feel like he was ever trying to feed me a line.
Back in the summer of 2017, Bob was in the room when Jay and the team presented their findings. He was one of those government guys who didn't seem so impressed.
I didn't get a 30-minute time slot to say, hey, Bob, what do you think about their presentation, right? I just had to sit there and take it, right? And that, to me, that's okay. That's the whole purpose of being an analyst. I mean, if you're going to get defensive of your shit, you'll never get anywhere, right?
What Bob thought of their presentation was that he already knew where to look for Ron Forrester. His agency was still focused on that rice paddy near Antwi. There was a waiting list for excavations, and when Ron Forrester's turn came up, that's where they would dig.
So you just have to be able to suck this up when they're yelling, screaming, crying, whatever it is, and you're saying, "Hey, I'm doing the best I can every day I come to work. That's what I do here. I can't please everybody, but I'm telling you where we're at."
Jay and the other researchers hadn't been satisfied with that. They believed the Vietnamese government knew more than it was telling, and they wanted the American government to press for answers. Bob knew very well that this kind of diplomacy was a delicate dance. This was the one subject where Bob tightened up a bit when I asked about it. Under the 1973 peace treaty, cooperation with finding MIAs was directly tied to billions in American aid. Information about remains, or the remains themselves, were valuable leverage for the Vietnamese government.
When we first started back in the early 90s, it was, it was more of a hardcore communist country, right? And there was no deviations, no nothing. It would seem like the witnesses were coached. Like, wow, how did you know the exact date of the incident? They had too many details for a guy that, 30, 40 years later, how would he know that? And we weren't getting a lot of cooperation. Like, if you didn't ask the right question, like the crash site could be wrong off by 500 meters, but they're not going to tell you because you didn't ask for it, right?
Some people they encountered were downright hostile because of their memories of the war. But today, Bob told me the relationship between the countries is a lot better. And anyway, in this case, he didn't doubt they had the right spot.
So I'm going, why am I doing research if I got the right site, right? You're going, this is the one. This is it.
But Kearney didn't quite share Bob's confidence.
I thought for a while for sure we were digging the wrong hole. And that's why one drum I was beating loud is, will you at least just go look? Will you at least go look at this other place? Can you just go confirm that it's not there? Or that there's not anything there?
Bob believed he had the right dig site, but he also gave credit to Jay's team for uncovering things the government hadn't. Bob said part of the reason has to do with how the DPAA is staffed.
They're looking at one case, and we're looking at, we'll say 50 to 100. We can't put that level of effort and have 4 experts, former F-4 pilot, an imagery analyst, the top Vietnamese interpreter, probably in the United States. That's hard to compete against them guys, right?
The research team knew this too. Here's Joseph.
So imagine you're running a cold case unit where you don't have enough people, you're overwhelmed by cases, and the detectives roll over every couple of years or so. I mean, the chances that you're going to resolve a case like Chipman and Forrester is pretty small, unless you get a lucky hit, there have been a few cases where people have come forward and said, yeah, I remember that, and I buried the guy over here, or I actually have his remains. Barring that from happening, it's a real low probability of success.
Despite those odds, DPAA has had success. When the U.S. and North and South Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, more than 2,600 Americans were MIA. DPAA has accounted for about 40% of them. There are still 1,573 Americans missing from the Vietnam War, including 99 Texans. And of all the wars the agency is investigating, Vietnam feels the most personal, because it's the one with the most family members who are still alive and hoping for answers.
I've been going to various league meetings and annual briefings for almost 20 years. And, it's a room full of hurting people. And so, while there is obviously a very strong technical analysis, there's a real sense of suffering and grieving among people. Some of these cases are just never going to be resolved.
To keep Ron Forrester's case from being one of them, Jay and the team made 6 recommendations. 3 had to do with the Quang Binh Museum, which had the photograph showing the wreckage of the 700th shootdown. The copy of this photo that the American investigators got isn't very clear. It's a photograph of a photograph, taken at an angle, a little blurry. It shows Vietnamese piling wreckage of what appears to be a jet, next to a rice paddy.
I told you, for Joseph and I spent hours trying to figure what this thing meant. I mean, Joseph calls it a Rorschach test. It was worse than that. So I had said earlier to one of the main government people, I had said, listen, just send somebody into the Quang Museum, take a direct overhead digital, in focus picture of this picture, give it to us. We will, for free, analyze this for you, tell you what you think, and give it to you. Well, for 3 years I asked him, yeah, we'll do it.
It took a while, but they did do it.
The guy went back to Vietnam, goes into the Quang Binh Museum, and what does he discover? not just that picture, but 6 more pictures taken that same day showing villagers stacking up wreckage in this rice paddy.
With a clearer photo to look at, Joseph's friend at the boneyard confirmed this was the wreckage of an A6. But even better, in the background of one of the photos is a mountain range. The mountains are in silhouette, and along the ridge there's a unique saddleback. You could line up those mountains against the foreground and figure out exactly where this rice paddy is located, and start digging. Years of waiting and fighting for small victories meant that Kearney always kept her hopes in check.
Know that I wasn't holding my breath. I mean, you sit somewhere being told to wait your turn. Oh, your turn's coming up. You believe it when you see it.
But not long after, Kearney got more news. Her father's search had reached the top of the list, but not because of the report or the photographs, at least not officially. Bob says the DPAA wasn't influenced by the 4 Horsemen and their work. Kearney thinks, at least, the report helped her light a fire underneath some seats.
When they finally had gone back into the museum and found more pictures, confirming what we had said, that the Vietnamese had more knowledge, and then the dig gets scheduled, so you can make your assumptions.
And at last, the DPAA was going to Vietnam to look for Jim Chipman and Ron Forrester. The dig was scheduled for early 2020. That's coming up on The Final Flight of Captain Forrester. The Final Flight of Captain Forrester is a Texas Monthly production. Our executive producer is Megan Cright. The show is reported and written by me, Josh Alvarez, and written and produced by Patrick Michaels. It was produced and engineered by Brian Standiford, who also wrote the music, with additional production by Ella Kopakin and Aisling Ayers. Story editing by J.K. Nickel, Ross McCammon, and Mark Warren. Paul Knight is our fact-checker. Artwork is by Emily Kimbrough and Victoria Milner. See y'all next week.